The sound science has been done when it comes to climate change. And those that aren't adhering to the sound science are doing it for reasons like ideology, or you dismiss the science for whatever foolish reason you come up with. I mean, the shit they say is just crazy. Hey, I'm Robert Eshelman, environment editor at Vice News, and I'm joining on the line today to take your questions about climate change and the environment. So who's up first, Michael?
Hey, Robert. Thanks for coming on. We have Matt, who's calling us from Royal Oak, Michigan, I believe. Is that right, Matt?
Yeah, that's right.
Hey, what's up, Matt?
Hey, I'm good. How you doing, Robert?
Good, good.
Oh, okay. So I had a couple questions really about the political nature of climate change, because it's a huge topic right now. So my first question is sort of a recent event of Obama traveling to Alaska to study the climate change and bring awareness. So I was wondering, what, if anything, do you think will happen after this trip he comes back in terms of policy changes, any sort of enlightening view, like a politician said this and not a scientist, maybe we should listen to him, like something like that? Do you think that anything like that will happen after Obama returns?
Well, it remains to be seen. Obama went up there and on day one attended a conference of foreign ministers from Arctic countries and sort of said the same thing that he and others who are demanding action on climate change have said all along, which is like, time is running out, we've got to cut greenhouse gas emissions, and we've got to do it at the end of this year at the UN climate talks in Paris. He then went on to look at some of the impacts of climate change, some melting glaciers. He went and looked at some indigenous communities along the coast that have been impacted by climate change. But really, this is like him doing what he has done previously, which is being a champion for climate change. But the significant thing that happened with his trip, I think, was that environmentalists pointed out a significant contradiction in his policies. On one hand, he's been a champion on climate change. He's been urging international action. He's used his executive authority in the United States to impose rules that cut greenhouse gas emissions from power plants, from automobiles, but he also greenlighted oil drilling in the Arctic. He greenlighted shale drilling for oil off the coast of Alaska. And so environmentalists really used, and I think very successfully, used Obama's trip up to the Arctic to point out this contradiction. And I think in some ways, Obama's trip backfired a little bit. He went up there expecting to be sort of, capture the headlines about being a champion for climate change. But really, environmentalists pushed the issue of his contradictory policies on energy development. So we'll see what the fallout is of that.
Do you think that this sort of going to Alaska concept is more of a seeing is believing thing with other politicians who haven't gone?
I think that the lines are pretty clearly drawn among America's political class. You have Obama, many Democrats, some Republicans, although not many, saying that, yeah, we need to produce more renewable energy, we need to cut greenhouse gas emissions. But I don't think Obama is necessarily going to convince any elected official in the United States that somehow that was against action to address climate change. I don't think they're going to turn the corner because of Obama's trip. But I do think it highlighted the issue of climate change and how it's impacting the U.S. now. It's not some abstract thing that's going to happen in the future. It's happening now in terms of glacier melt, rising temperatures, wildfires, coastal communities being impacted. And so I think, it elevates the issue, but what that means, how that translates into policy changes, it's not clear to me that it's going to do much.
All right, and then last question is, when you talk about these policy changes, what do you believe the relationship between scientists and politicians should be when talking about climate change? Because we see that some politicians say, no, scientists are wrong, but not really using a lot to back it up. But should they be so intertwined in politics that you don't know who you're actually voting for, if you're voting for a politician or a scientist that backs that politician? So what do you think the relationship should be?
Well, I think there's very particular things about the relationship between climate scientists and politicians, which is that the science community is, there's consensus on the fundamentals of climate change, that human-generated emissions are warming the planet, and unless we cut those emissions, significantly by mid-century, we're going to see a level of global temperature rise that really doesn't sustain, that really impacts human societies significantly, with sea level rise, with increased precipitation in some areas, increased, more frequent, more severe droughts in others, more frequent extreme weather events. And so that science is well-founded, it's established, and many politicians adhere to what scientists are recommending, but many of them don't. They just dismiss the science out of hand. And I don't think that, I don't see that changing. Scientists advise politicians. I wouldn't advocate for a rule of experts. Obviously, I don't know that if that's what you're getting at, but I don't think we want scientists setting policy, but I think we want policy and laws in the United States based upon sound science. And the sound science has been done when it comes to climate change. And those that aren't adhering to the sound science are doing it for reasons like ideology. They don't want government intervention in the marketplace. They don't want laws that restrict what power plants can emit into the air. It's a philosophical choice for them to adhere to science that says you have to intervene in the marketplace to address environmental pollution, or you dismiss the science for whatever foolish reason you come up with. I mean, the shit they say is just crazy. It's like, and I don't see that changing if there's more reports. I mean, the reports that are coming out are more severe. They're narrowing in on some details about how climate change is impacting the atmosphere and oceans. But I think these scientific studies are going to continue to come out. They're going to continue to clarify what's going on, and the politicians that aren't listening to those scientists are going to continue to ignore the science.
All right, thank you. Thank you very much. I agree.
Great questions. Thanks. Yeah.
All right, thanks, Matt. So, Robert, we're getting some tweets, and I want to take a look at this one that we got from Alex. Alex wants to know how you think the oil and gas industry are going to play a role in the climate change debate. What role do you think they will play?
I think they're going to play the exact same role that they've continued to play, which is to obstruct any sort of action internationally or domestically on curbing emissions. Despite the fact that the science is pretty clear that whatever fossil fuel reserves are in the ground and have been identified by fossil fuel companies, those reserves need to stay in the ground. They cannot be developed, they cannot be burnt, unless you really want to set off catastrophic level of global warming. And so, you have shale oil right now, drilling doing exploratory drilling in the Arctic Ocean, looking for more oil and natural gas deposits. And there's a lot of it up there, but their interest is to generate profits for their investors and for their shareholders. And, perhaps there's going to be some fossil fuel corporations that are a bit more forward-looking and make some sort of transition from developing oil and natural gas deposits and developing more wind and solar and renewable energy sources. But I don't see that. I don't see them doing that on their own. I see them doing that when they're forced to by societies and governments that restrict where and what they do.
Cool. Well, I hope that answers your question, Alex. Speaking of the oceans, which you brought up a little bit, I know Heidi, who's calling us on Skype, has a couple questions about the oceans. So let's say hey to Heidi.
Cool. Hey, Heidi.
Hi, Robert. Thanks so much for being here. So I hear a lot about the rising of sea levels, the warming of surface temperatures, and also recently I've heard about carbon dioxide levels increasing, which is altering the ocean's bacteria, crucial to the food chain. Can you elaborate a bit on that and how this is truly affecting the health of our oceans?
Yeah, no, I think you nailed it. It's the oceans are getting hotter. They're absorbing the majority of the excess heat that's being trapped in the atmosphere. The excess heat is being trapped in the atmosphere because of all these greenhouse gases, and a lot of it is going into the oceans. And that does two things. It warms the oceans and it makes them more acidic. And with warming oceans, You see the breakdown of the very base of the food chain. You see species migrating to different parts of the oceans. You see species dying out. I mean, I think one thing that really sums up a lot of what's going on with climate change was there were researchers this spring that found polar bears eating dolphins in Norway. And those dolphins, you know, their habitat is pretty far north, but in the spring, in the summer. And so these dolphins are farther north because of warming ocean temperatures, and they're now in habitats where they're cohabitating with polar bears. And so you see, warming oceans are shifting around what species reside where and during what times of the year. But then, you know, as oceans become more acidic, you know, you see like the Great Barrier Reef, coral reefs in the Caribbean being affected, and they are also really crucial to ocean ecosystems in terms of like habitat, just places where fish and other little ocean critters reside, but also how the food chain operates. And with warming oceans, you know, going back to the Arctic, the summer sea ice extent and the winter sea ice extent, for that matter, has been shrinking consistently year after year. And what that means is, you know, that affects weather patterns, you know, throughout the world, all over the globe. And so the oceans are, you know, integrated, like fully integrated into the Earth's climate system, and they're being impacted by the way, you know, we're fucking up the atmosphere.
Wow. So with the world's current state, how rapidly are things becoming severe and the damage basically irreversible? You know, species dying off, and that, like what you were saying, the food chain being disrupted. How long do we have until things are irreversible?
Well, there's already irreversible changes. I mean, this spring, U.S.-based scientists, every year, U.S. government scientists issue their State of the Climate report. And this year it focused very heavily on the state of the oceans. And they say that many of the changes that we've seen are irreversible and changes are going to become much more widespread and much deeper unless there's a significant reduction in the amount of pollution that humans are putting into the atmosphere. So, you know, when is it irreversible? Well, that was, you know, according to these U.S. scientists, several months ago.
Wow. Okay. So my third and final question is about, not about the ocean, actually, it's about El Nino. I'm hearing this year it's going to be globally like the worst we've had in 18 years. So can you speak a little bit about that and your knowledge about El Nino? Yeah,
well, El Nino is, in fact, related to the oceans because it is a naturally occurring, just for the benefit of those that don't know about El Nino is a naturally occurring phenomenon where ocean temperatures become abnormally warm in the eastern Pacific. And this generally happens, it's part of the natural climate system. It happens every 2 to 7 years. Now, some scientists say that you graft El Nino on top of already hot ocean temperatures, and it spikes the intensity of El Nino. And so what that means is, in places along the East Coast, the West Coast of the United States, there'll be more intense rainfall, which would be great for California, potentially, because it's had this significant drought. But El Nino also causes very hot, dry conditions in places like Indonesia, Australia, and the Philippines. And those places, you know, Australia has been hit by extremely high temperatures the last several years, has had really very intense wildfire seasons. Indonesia, of course, has like wildfires going on all the time because they're slashing and burning rainforests to make way for palm oil plantations and pulp and paper plantations. And so all of those conditions become exacerbated by El Nino, which is exacerbated potentially. The jury's still out, but some scientists think that El Nino is becoming more intense, perhaps more frequent because of climate change. But those are great questions. Thank you.
Oh, thank you so much.
Yeah, you bet.
Yeah, thanks, Heidi, for coming on. So, Robert, we're getting a bunch more tweets, and I saw 2 tweets actually on the same topic. Curtis wants to know, what would you say to those people who claim that the temperature increases are part of the Earth's natural cycle? And Marcus echoed that sentiment, asking how much merit does that argument carry, really?
It has that much merit. I would say it's complete bullshit. The science has been there is little, if any, disagreement among the science community on the fact that human-generated greenhouse gases are causing the planet to warm. The role of natural, of course, there is natural variability in the Earth's climate, but that variability, that fluctuations, temperatures should be going down a bit. And so it's really very, very clear, unequivocally clear, that human beings are driving temperatures to rise, in the atmosphere and the oceans. It's just not, natural climate variability is not, at play here, nor is volcanoes, nor is sunspots, nor is any of that. It's human beings increasing atmospheric temperatures, which are being absorbed by the ocean, and it's fucking it all up.
So alien intervention's completely out as well. There's no alien intervention.
Oh well, now you're talking about something completely different. But
okay. Let's get it back to the climate, and I'm going to let Matt do that. This is Matthew, actually. Let's say to Matthew in Brooklyn.
Hey, Matthew in Brooklyn.
Hey, good afternoon, Robert. Nice to be here.
Nice to have you here. Or via video, you're in your kitchen, I guess.
Yeah. So in recent years, China has been largely criticized by the global community for its lack of regulation of carbon emissions and water pollution. In relation to these, can you speak to the role that China plays in combating carbon emissions on a global scale?
That's a great question and an extremely important one. China is right now the largest annual contributor to climate. It's got the highest emissions of any nation in the world. I mean, it's a huge country. It tops the U.S. So it is making a significant contribution to global climate change. And so it's very important that China reduce its emissions very, very quickly if there's any chance of keeping global temperature rise below 2 degrees Celsius, which scientists say we must do in order to avoid kind of catastrophic consequences. Now, what I think is important about your question is China gets, particularly with Republicans in the United States, China constantly gets accused of not doing anything about climate change, when in fact it's doing a lot of very significant things about climate change. It's pledged to peak its emissions by 2030. It's unclear what that peak will be and what will happen after the peak, but its government has come forward and said, we're going to address climate change. We're going to curb emissions. It's shutting down coal plants. It's trying to use cleaner, lower sulfur coal, which is basically to address a lot of the air pollution concerns in cities like Beijing, which have been blanketed by really severe air pollution. But China's doing a lot. It's ramping up a lot of wind and solar energy. And so I think its contributions have been as significant, potentially even more significant than, say, the United States. And so I think, there was an agreement, there was a joint agreement between the US and China recently where both countries came forward with pledges to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. Those are great. They need to be enforced, and they probably need to be increased before the end of the year to really kind of send a message that the two largest contributors to global climate change are really taking it seriously.
Yeah, it's really interesting to see the steps that Beijing takes around important summits and meetings in their capital city. They really go all out in cutting back total emissions.
Yeah.
I do have one more question for you, though. This is concerning the fresh water in China. And to what extent have the rivers and lakes in China been affected by these pollution factors?
What do you mean? You mean carbon pollution? You mean climate change?
Talking more along the lines of water pollution.
Yeah. Well, I mean, China's rivers are, essential to commerce, to agriculture, to human consumption. Providing drinking water, and China faces very, very serious environmental problems because of the amount of industry that's ramped up in the last decade or so, 2 decades, and it's been slow to impose environmental regulations. But in my view, the last couple of years, particularly with the severe smog that's hit its large cities on the West Coast, I think it's caused somewhat of a legitimacy crisis for the government, which is like you have a rising middle class in China saying like, you promised us, if we worked hard, we'd achieve middle class status, and then here we are blanketed in all this smog in these cities, and it's like a really awful sort of lifestyle for people, and they're pissed. And China has tried to hide the information about what its air quality is, how poor its air quality is, and there's been a backlash. I mean, there's environmental organizing, there's a lot of protests. I would love to send a reporter to China to really dig into the Chinese environmental movement. It's very interesting. It's a difficult thing to do, but it's very vibrant. There's been a lot of backlash about air quality, water quality in China, and I think that's creating some pressure on the central government to respond.
Oh yeah, absolutely.
All right, thank you, Matthew. So Robert, we're just about at the end of the show, but we got this tweet from Rahul that I want to take a look at. Rahul wants to know, is it too late to prevent a climate catastrophe? And if not, what are the odds that we're going to prevent it, or what can we do?
Yeah, I mean, not to make it too complicated, but there's already a climate catastrophe for a lot of people. This summer, July was the hottest month on record. Hottest month ever recorded. Heat waves earlier this year killed thousands of people in India and Pakistan. So I think that's catastrophic when there's that level of human loss because of temperature rise. Just today, there was a report listed that the current pledges to cut greenhouse gases will likely lead to, are insufficient and will likely lead to 3 degrees Celsius temperature rise compared to pre-industrial age temperatures. And that means several feet of sea level rise. That means melting of the ice caps. That means melting glaciers. And so that, I think is, I don't know that anybody would argue that that's not a catastrophe. And so that's the situation now. So, what are the odds of preventing it? That's the important question. And I think that comes down to how successful are environmentalists, people concerned about climate change, how successful are they at pressuring governments to constrain polluters, to constrain the marketplace, and to force investment away from fossil fuel burning and into renewable energy sources.
All right. Well, so there might be a little bit of hope for us, but hey, Robert, thanks for coming on and bringing us some doom and gloom.
That's my job.
There you go. So with that, why don't you say goodbye to the folks at home?
It's been great. Thanks for having me on. I look forward to coming back and taking more questions about the climate and the environment. And check out our coverage on Vice News.
As climate change is projected to make California's periodic droughts more frequent and intense, water issues will keep plaguing the state. And between an outdated water system built over 100 years ago and controversial new groundwater legislation that doesn't go into effect for another 25 years, things seem likely to get worse.